This frog is trying to tell us something. So is this one. And this one.
Here's the one with an extra leg. 2 extra front legs on the left side of that one. Both quite worthless, one sticking up and one is upside down.
Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I say, good grief, what is this?
That is the question scientists around the world are trying to answer. Some are more worried than others.
You see those frogs out there, you'll have people that look like that.
Could what's happening to them happen to people? Tonight, the frogs. What are they really telling us? It's easy enough to dismiss frogs as either cute or repulsive, depending on your point of view, but they do get around. They tend to breed in shallow water, they hop around and feed on the landscape as mature adults, and depending on the season, they also feed in deeper waters, rivers, and lakes. For a whole variety of reasons, frogs are good biological barometers, early warning systems of possible dangers in the environment. If frogs begin showing signs of distress, it could be only a matter of time before other species are affected, including humans. What seemed at first like a freakish quirk of nature, the appearance of a few truly deformed frogs, has now occurred in a dozen states, and the Biological Resources Division of the U.S. Geological Survey has actually set up a website with background information, photographs, and maps. They're concerned enough that they want Americans to be on the lookout this summer. Nightline producer Dan Morris and correspondent Chris Bury have been tracking this story for weeks now.
Ooh, who's documenting?
2 leopard frogs, tadpoles.
This is Ground Zero, the farm pond in southern Minnesota, where many believe the mystery begins.
It feels like a bony structure there. This shouldn't be.
Chip, these are...
Jack, can we take a photograph of that? I've not seen this little bulge right here before. Seems a bit unusual.
Yeah. This month, middle school teacher Cindy Reinitz returned to the place where nearly 2 years ago, in August 1995, she and some students stumbled upon a bizarre discovery during a nature outing.
As we walked along a field road, the kids started catching frogs because they were jumping everywhere on the field road. We weren't even close to the water. And one of the kids came up and showed me a frog that had a really odd leg.
Later on, we caught some with only one eye and some with 5 front legs. That was one of the grossest ones I've ever seen. 5 extra front legs.
We found some where it would grow normally to the knee, and then it would branch off into all these different feet. There were some where the legs were just grossly twisted and misshapen.
It seemed like
a lot of them with only one leg.
It seemed like the closer we got to the pond, the grosser the deformities. It was like, great, there's a problem here. Cool.
At first, the deformed frogs found here were greeted with skepticism in the scientific community. One biologist suggested perhaps someone dumped a can of paint thinner into this pond. But then, the deformed frogs started turning up all over the state of Minnesota, and the discovery by school kids here set scientists off on an urgent international search for answers.
How pervasive is this? How many counties were these deformed frogs found in?
I would say about 2 out of 3 counties in Minnesota, 2/3 of the counties of Minnesota have reports.
University of Minnesota biologist Robert McKinnell has spent most of his professional life, nearly 50 years, studying frogs.
I have never seen the gross deformities that we're seeing now. If you ask me, did I ever see a frog that had a missing leg, the chances are I did see 1 or 2 during those many years. But this is quite different when you have extra legs growing, an extra leg that has 2 extra feet on it, or missing eyes, or abnormalities such as that. I have never in my career of looking at frogs, which goes back to 1958, I've never seen abnormalities like these.
Notice how the right eye has that completely dark pigmentation, and the left eye is transparent, the outer portion of the eye.
David Hoppe, another University of Minnesota biologist, has documented deformities from eyes in the wrong place to frogs with as many as 9 legs.
2 extra front legs on the left side of that one. Both quite worthless, one sticking up and one is upside down. But his normal front leg gets him around pretty well.
The mystery leads far beyond Minnesota, where these red dots represent places where deformed frogs have been found. Similar abnormalities have now been reported in Canada's St. Lawrence River Valley and in Vermont, where dozens of deformed frogs were collected last summer in Lake Champlain.
And I said, good grief, when they got here, they look like our frogs. That is, the abnormal frogs look like our abnormal frogs.
Same abnormalities.
Same kind
in
of
Vermont
abnormalities. And so we have to think that whatever is occurring here may very well be occurring in Vermont.
Like detectives digging for clues to a crime, scientists too are chasing down leads. At the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, biologist Judy Helgen examines frog eggs to trace the precise origin of the deformities.
When are the animals exposed? If you saw abnormalities right in the very earliest egg stage, you would think that they're either exposed right when they get in the water or they may be carrying something in to the eggs.
We're asking the question this year, will this beautiful adult frog and all of its compatriots, will these frogs give rise to abnormal offspring? We don't know that for sure, but because there were so many last year, we think it's a real possibility.
This spring, Professor McKinnell and his colleagues began tracking frogs as they emerged from icy Minnesota lakes. Here, adult frogs are crossing a road to begin breeding in nearby ponds where the females will lay eggs. McKinnell believes whatever is causing the deformities is probably happening right here.
What is in a breeding pond? Tadpoles. They're developing. And at this time, they're exposed to something that is in that pond water that is causing them to be abnormal.
They're picking it up in the embryonic and early tadpole stages in the pond water. Probably not from the insects they eat, probably not from the soil, from the leaf litter that they're laying in, from the water that they're hibernating in. It's most likely the pond water.
Like the canary in the coal mine, many scientists see the deformed frogs as an early warning sign to humans. Frogs are highly susceptible to changes in the environment because of their super-sensitive skin and because their life cycle takes place in water and on land. The scientific consensus is the frogs are telling us something important.
If it were just one animal here and one animal there, we would say, well, there is a normal mutation rate or there's a normal rate of abnormalities like there is with any kind of animal. But this is so much bigger and it's so much more widespread that we really feel, I'd have to say driven is the word for those of us who are working on this.
We've got a problem. I think the problem is real. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I say, good grief, what is this?
So the hunt is on. The mystery of the Minnesota frogs has now caught the attention of scientists worldwide, and they are just starting to close in on some leading suspects.
We'll identify the 2 leading suspects in part 2 of Chris Bury's report when we come back.
.us/hot/frogs.html. That goes to the Deformed Frog page.
In their own modest attempt to solve the mystery, those kids from the Minnesota New Country School posted a horror show of deformities on the internet. Nearly 2,000 miles away, at the University of California in Irvine, the pictures startled biologist David Gardner, a leading expert in the way animals develop.
Every picture of every frog that they've showed me, I can show you a picture of an animal, a frog or a mouse, that looks exactly like that, except that I can tell you how that animal got to be that way.
In a lab.
In a lab.
Here in your lab, can you create the same kind of extra limbs and defects
Yes.
that they're seeing in Minnesota?
Yeah, and actually more important than that is I could do it, and there are probably 100 different labs in the world that could do it.
Indeed, scientists have produced nearly identical deformities, like these extra limbs, in mice. This fifth leg here in the middle of a mouse fetus looks almost exactly like this extra limb on the middle of a Minnesota frog. In the lab, the extra legs are created using powerful molecules known as retinoids.
They're like a switch. They say, do this, don't do that, now do this, don't do that. And then all the rest of it, all the program for making legs is perfectly normal in these frogs. They make normal legs, just wrong place, wrong time, wrong place. You can control when and where you make a limb by treating experimentally with retinoids.
If this sounds a bit like Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, well, it is. One reason biologists are experimenting with retinoids is because they hope one day to regenerate human limbs, arms and legs, for example, that have been lost in accidents. But scientists also know that retinoids are so risky, they can, in a sense, make monsters.
The FDA warns again that Accutane may cause severe birth defects, that more needs to be done to warn doctors and young women about the risks.
The FDA found the acne treatment Accutane, which contains retinoids, involved in more than 130 cases of human birth defects, including cleft palate, abnormal skulls, brains, hearts, and eyes. The drug carries explicit warnings that it should not be taken during pregnancy. But what does that have to do with deformed frogs?
I look at the frogs, and they look like they've been treated with retinoids. So then the next step is if these look like retinoids, then is there any evidence that there's something in the environment that would act like a retinoid? And there is one pesticide out there that does, in fact, activate one of the retinoid receptors.
That pesticide is methoprene, one of several compounds widely used against mosquitoes, biting flies, and fleas. In liquid sprays and solid tablets, it is a synthetic compound that acts like a retinoid to switch off the growth of insects before they become annoying, reproducing adults. Methoprene is so powerful that only 1 teaspoon is enough to cover an entire acre.
They should be considered a prime suspect.
At the Salk Institute in San Diego, biologist Bruce Blumberg is just beginning experiments with methoprene.
The simplest hypothesis would be that there's a causal link between the retinoid-like compounds in the environment and the retinoid-like defects that you see in the wild population. And in my view, that would be the very first explanation one ought to investigate.
The company that makes methoprene, Wellmark International, declined an on-camera interview, but a company biologist did tell us that its own tests of methoprene on frogs at 500 times normal concentration have failed to produce any deformities, and that methoprene is not used in many places where deformed frogs have been found. What's more, at least one solitary investigator is convinced the mystery of the Minnesota frogs is really a centuries-old story.
We can trace it back to the mid-1700s, where people have found these deformed frogs with extra limbs and puzzled over what they could possibly be. And this has been in the literature on a continuous rate over 2 centuries.
Stan Sessions, a biology professor at Hartwick College in New York, believes the leading suspect is a natural one, a microscopic parasite.
I'm more confident than I've ever been that we have an explanation for the bulk, for the majority of the frogs that have extra limbs. I think that those, probably all of those frogs are caused by this parasite.
The parasite, called a trematode, is born by snails in the same kinds of ponds where frogs breed. As you can see in this film, the trematodes burrow into young tadpoles and attack the buds where limbs develop.
They move right into the limb bud. And in doing so, they split the limb bud into several parts, and each one of those parts then grows to form a separate limb.
Professor Sessions and his students have tried to duplicate the deformities by surgically implanting tiny beads into tadpoles.
We implanted those into the limb buds, as many as we could, trying to mimic what was happening with the parasite. And we did indeed get frogs with extra limbs.
But many scientists are skeptical of Sessions' theory because parasites have not been found in all of Minnesota's deformed frogs, and because otherwise healthy four-legged frogs often contain parasites. Professor Sessions himself hedges on one important point.
You cannot say for certain that the frogs in Minnesota have parasite cysts because you haven't studied those frogs.
That's right.
There's one little experiment suggesting that parasites can cause extra digits. There's no evidence that it causes extra arms, no evidence it causes arms growing out all over the place or cleft palate or eye. There's just no evidence for it.
So now the detectives in this mystery are squabbling over the two leading suspects, pesticides and parasites. But just wait, the plot thickens. Here in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, scientists are exploring yet another set of clues. A team of biologists from Oregon State University has made an important, even startling discovery that too much ultraviolet radiation from the sun can permanently damage some species of frogs. The operating theory is the Earth's thinning ozone layer may be a significant piece of the puzzle.
5.48.
Researchers led by Andrew Blaustein are trying to explain the dramatic decline of some frog species, even in places like this where pollution and pesticides are rare.
So what we do is we cover the tadpoles up with shields. They're either shields that allow ultraviolet in or shields that block ultraviolet. And we're comparing the groups.
Their work has already proven that too much ultraviolet radiation destroys frog eggs.
The more ultraviolet they get, the more likely they are to die. We're now looking to see whether this same thing occurs in the larval stage and in the adult stage when they metamorphose and turn into frogs.
The research here may help unlock the mystery because it also shows excess ultraviolet weakens a frog's immune system, making it more vulnerable to parasites or disease.
Some people have shown an interaction between ultraviolet and pesticides, and there may be an interaction between ultraviolet and parasites. So we're looking at all these things. It's a complicated system.
It's not going to be one simple answer.
I don't think it'll be one simple answer, no.
That leads to another question. Could a pesticide, such as methoprene, break down into something more sinister in certain ultraviolet or UV conditions?
UV accelerates the degradation of some environmental chemicals. So a pesticide like this one, which maybe doesn't cause any effect to predators in itself, may degrade in UV light to something that's more nasty. And DDT degrading to DDE is a classic example.
DDE is a highly toxic byproduct of the pesticide DDT, banned 25 years ago because it accumulated in the food chain, threatened the bald eagle, among other species, and is suspected as a cause of cancer in humans. Fear of a similar environmental disaster is what's driving scientists to crack the case of the Minnesota frogs.
Those frogs are telling us that we've got a problem, and that we better make real sure that we don't get exposed the way they got exposed. Because that's what'll happen. You see those frogs out there, you know, you'll have people that look like that. I mean, you can make mice that look like that.
We ought to know, and know fast, because I would hate to think that some pregnant woman would be exposed to whatever it is causing this that would cause human fetal abnormalities, or of course abnormalities at birth. It would just distress me tremendously.
The mystery, with all its twists and turns, will hardly be solved overnight. But the concern is great enough that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and state officials in Minnesota have launched full-scale investigations. So the tadpoles that come of age this summer will be the most examined ones in modern history. Ted?
It began as a localized affair in Minnesota. Now it's spread out over 12 states, even some reports from Japan. What do we conclude from that?
That concerns a lot of scientists, and the thing that really concerns them is that the deformities they're seeing in places like Vermont are identical to the ones
they're seeing in Minnesota. And there have been so many of these, which is rare, it leads them to suspect that there's some environmental agent.
But there is no agreement as yet within the scientific community.
There is not. There's incredible rivalry to the point where some scientists are not speaking to each other.
Do parents need to be concerned if the youngsters start coming back with frogs this summer?
I mean, the quick answer is scientists don't know, but frogs are like environmental sponges. They soak up everything in the environment. They're considered a sentinel species, so scientists are concerned that there could be some possible human connection.
Chris Bury, thanks very much. I'll be back in a moment.